Good evening. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Ways of Knowing students.
Thank you. The lady with the big voice.
To Judith.
Before we begin, I'm going to ask you to please turn your cell phones off. And then I'm going to welcome you all to our second Ways of Knowing plenary lecture. For this second plenary, we've decided to try something new. Rather than a single speaker, we've arranged for a panel of our own faculty members who will present on 3 of the distinct ways of knowing that are highlighted in our course. Our hope is that this will, 1, explore several different ways of knowing that human beings may use to understand their world, themselves, and others, and to search for meaning and purpose. 2, help you draw comparisons and identify points of contrast between these distinct ways of knowing in order to better evaluate what kinds of questions and knowledge each of them connect to. And 3, present diverse faculty perspectives on what we hope you gain from this course and why we've selected some of these readings. So our speakers for this evening are Dan Spencer, who will discuss mythological ways of knowing, Pat Burke, who will discuss philosophical ways of knowing, and Sue Bradford, who will discuss scientific ways of knowing. Before we get started, you'll see that there are note cards at the end of each of your rows, and I'm going to ask you to pass those in so that everybody has one. We're going to ask you to participate by asking questions after the panel. So please use these cards to record your questions so that we can collect them and draw from them later. Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to provide a little bit of background on each of the speakers for you before we begin. I'm going to start with Dan Spencer. Dan Spencer is Professor of Environmental Studies and has taught at the University of Montana since 2002. Some of his areas of teaching and research interest include ecological ethics, ethical issues in ecological restoration and globalization, justice, and environmental issues in Latin America and Southeast Asia. He was born and raised in California and received his BA in geology from Carleton College, Minnesota in 1979, and his master's in theology and PhD in environmental ethics from Union Theological Seminary in New York. Dan Spencer is also an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ. His commitment to the well-being of the earth is rooted in a passion for both ecology and theology, and he considers himself to be a, quote, liberation geologian, unquote, linking social and environmental justice concerns while reveling in the beauty of the Rocky Mountain West. He is the co-author of Earth Ethics, a case method approach, and will be teaching an honors course in Earth Ethics during spring 2017. Pat Burke. Pat Burke's diverse academic past includes undergraduate degrees in philosophy and forestry, along with master's degrees in philosophy and forest ecology. This broad-minded academic background is reflected in his employment history, which includes working as a U.S. Forest Service wilderness ranger and trail crew foreman for 7 years, followed by 20 years as founder and president of BRI, an ecological restoration company. During the last 9 years, he has taught field courses in restoration ecology and environmental ethics for the Wild Rockies Field Institute, along with traditional university courses in the philosophy department and the Honors College. His areas of interest and expertise include environmental ethics, philosophy of technology, and restoration ecology. He will be teaching an exciting new course in the philosophy department next semester called Ethics in the Environmental Crisis that will examine both the causes of the global environment crisis and what we should do to create a new, truly sustainable future. And our third speaker, last but not least, Sue Bradford, has been teaching Ways of Knowing since 2011. As an undergraduate, Sue attended St. John's College in Santa Fe, where all students complete a similar course of studies that examines seminal works in philosophy, literature, mathematics, language, and science. There are no majors at St. John's, but the degree translates roughly to a double major in philosophy and history of math and science, with a double minor in comparative literature and classical studies. In 1989, Sue came north to Missoula, Montana, to earn a master's degree in environmental studies, where she focused on dispute resolution and collaborative planning. She also fell in love with the rugged beauty of Montana and became involved in community gardens, wildlife advocacy, ecological restoration, and a variety of social justice issues. After working on environmental issues for 10 years, Sue returned to the University of Montana to study education and earned a doctorate in curriculum and instruction and a teaching license in secondary mathematics. Sue has taught classes at University of Montana since 2005 and remains keenly interested in educational practices that support responsible citizenship and collaborative problem solving. And so now let's begin with Professor Dan Spencer on mythology.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. I'm going to start with a question. How many of you remember as a childhood being told stories? And how many of you enjoyed those stories as a kid? I start that way because humans by nature, I would say we're genetically predisposed to tell stories. And that's because, as far as we know, humans are the only species that must interpret our environment in order to know how to live within it. Almost every other animal species can rely on instinct, another genetic programming, but human beings must complement our instinct by telling stories so that we understand our environment in order to know how to live that. And so of the ways of knowing we're going to be talking about tonight, I'm going to argue that mythological or storytelling ways of knowing is the oldest way that human beings have known their world. Some of you have been reading Black Elk Speaks. You may remember how Black Elk starts his story here. He says, "My friend, I'm going to tell you the story of my life. It's the story of all life that is holy and is good to tell, and of us two-leggeds sharing in it with the four-leggeds and the wings of the air and all green things. For these are children of one mother, and their father is spirit." What Black Elk has done is given a short example of what we call myth. Myth is a story that is a sacred story within a culture. It's somehow sacred, meaning it's authoritative. It tells something about the identity, the origins, the destiny, the understanding of people there. If you unpack what Black Elk talked about there, you have a whole cosmology of human beings being interrelated with birds, with insects, with animals, coming from the earth, relating to the sky. All of that is wrapped up in that story there. And so it's important to start understanding that all cultures and societies are rooted in stories, both ancient cultures, but I'll also make the case contemporary cultures. And those stories that are considered authoritative in that society or culture are what anthropologists or scholars call myths. Myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which simply means story. Okay? What separates myths from other stories is they're considered authoritative or sacred within that tradition. Now, sometimes we have some confusion in our world because there's at least two common definitions of myth in our society. One is a myth is a traditional story, especially one that concerns an early history of a people or explains natural phenomena and sometimes involves supernatural beings. And we'll talk about that understanding of myth here. But another understanding of myth in our society is myth is a widely held but false belief. So you hear the phrase, "that's just a myth." We use that to sort of dismiss something as being something untrue. And I would try and unpack a little bit for you where these two different definitions come from. But I want to start with some examples that I think will be fairly familiar to us. How many folks at some point have studied Greek mythology? Right? Almost all of you have studied something about Athena or Zeus or Poseidon. We're kind of familiar with that here. Former Ways of Knowing professor Ron Perrin, who gave a talk on mythology and philosophy for many years here, said that what the Greeks did through their gods was express their sheer delight in the diversity of human experience. They understood and symbolized this diversity of their own experience through the diversity of the Greek gods. And so Ron Perrin talked about how the gods functioned in Greek society. First, If you're familiar with the Greek gods, they gave functions and process of nature human-like agency. So Poseidon was seen down in the ocean there, causing earthquakes. And Zeus was in the heavens, throwing lightning bolts down. Each of the different gods was assigned to a natural force, and that helped the Greeks understand the diversity of natural forces, which were out of human control. They must have been in some other kind of control. So the Greek gods offered an explanatory framework of the features of nature in a pre-scientific age. Nature was seen as a force. Nature could be both benevolent but also malevolent. You depend on nature to provide the rains, but when those rains come in a hurricane, they can be destructive. A mythic understanding also can help to explain events that outstrip human abilities to comprehend them. So some of us are reading the Bacchae in Euripides there. And in the Bacchae, he attributes the phenomenon of hysteria to the god Dionysus. At times, when sometimes groups of people to get together and they become overcome by a group thing, whether it's battle hysteria or mob hysteria. That was another function of the Greeks there. And then the Greek gods, or the Greeks justified their way of living because that's how they understood the Greek gods to living that way as well there. And we'll see some of this. I'll come back and maybe talk a little bit about how this functions, like in Socrates. We're going to be reading Plato, Socrates, the Apology. But I also want to mention that myth as sacred story is not just found in ancient cultures, they're found in our own. And so I want to give you some examples from two groups of people to whom I belong. Let me tell you one story here and see if you can identify it for me. There was a group of people who lived far across the ocean from where their ancestors had grown up. And they started a new society where they were living. But they were still enslaved to a dictatorial king who lived on the other side of the ocean. So one night, in order to rebel against this king, they dressed themselves up in indigenous clothing, went out in rowboats to a ship that the king had in the harbor there. They took the king's tea and they dumped it in the ocean there. Anybody recognize that? The Boston Tea Party, right? One of the familiar stories from out there. How about this one? There once was a ruler of a great land. When he was a boy, he was a good behaving boy. But one day he was feeling mischievous, so he cut down a cherry tree. And his parents came along and said, "Why have you cut down that cherry tree?" Or what happened to that cherry tree? And what did he say? "I cannot tell a lie. I did it," all right? What story is that? George Washington, right? With this notion here. Now, those are stories that we still tell in our story. Did those stories actually happen? One yes, one no. All right, and this is a really important thing about myth. Myths are sacred stories which may or may not have happened historically. The key thing about understanding myth is the truth of the story doesn't lie in whether it's literally factually true. The truth of the story lies in what meaning it conveys for the people there. So even though we can discredit the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, we still tell that story because it tells something about the sacred values of what it means to be an American, that our rulers are honest. They're there. Or that the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation. We will not submit to tyranny. These sacred values and stories come through the story, so we still tell them there. Now, I also mentioned I want to tell you a couple other stories, at least tell you one. How am I doing for time, Judith? 2.5 minutes. So let me move along here quickly. We'll have time for discussion here. Here's another couple stories that are important in another community to whom I belong. In those days, a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth to Galilee and Judea to a city called Bethlehem. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and was expecting a child. But there was no room in the inns there, so she gave birth in a manger. Right? What story is this? The birth narrative of Jesus, right? And we go on here, it talks about, then the angels came and said, "Glory to God in the heaven, on peace among those whom he favors" there. A very familiar story in our context here, but it's a story that for one particular group, that is people who consider themselves Christians, is an authoritative story. It tells something about the founder of their religion, of Jesus there. A second story that also is told in there, when the hour came, Jesus took his place at the table and the apostles with him. And he said, "I have a desire to eat this Passover with you." And then he took the cup and he said, "This is my body," or he took the bread, "This is my body which is given to you. This is the cup this is poured out for you." What story is this? This is the story of the Last Supper, the Passover there. How do Christians remember this story? Depends on which group you are, but I grew up in the Catholic Church. We remember this story by every week by taking communion, right? How do Christians remember the birth narrative? On Christmas, we have set aside a day for it here. And that's another point I want to mention about sacred stories. They're oftentimes connected to ritual. They're connected to the ways we act out those stories. And the key thing to understand is the combination of the story and acting them out shapes the character of the people. That is, the very identity of the people gets shaped by telling these stories and acting them out. And you can see this in tradition after tradition there. We act out the story of what it means to be American on the 4th of July. We light fireworks off to symbolize our independence in that area there. So these stories get connected when we act them out, and they serve to shape who we are as a people. So the last thing I want to mention here is there's a particular branch of myth that are called origin myths, origin stories. We read some examples in the book of Genesis there that function for Jews and Christians as their origin stories. Every culture has them. And they tell these stories because these stories accomplish three things. I want you to write these down and remember them. Your flurry of activity. Origin stories tell us where we came from. They tell us who we are. That gives a sense of identity. And they tell us where we're going, our destiny. So these are stories that anchor people in their understanding of who they are as a people or culture by understanding where they came from, who they are today, and where they're going. And in our discussion time, we'll have a chance to play out some more of these things here. So I'm right at the end of my time. Turn it over now.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is Pat Burke on philosophy.
All right, well, tonight's doubly difficult for me. It's always intimidating to follow Dan. He's such an accomplished speaker, and also the Giants are playing the Mets tonight, and it's difficult to be here. So I kind of reframed what I'm going to talk about a little bit. I'm going to talk about what is philosophy as a way of knowing, okay? Philosophy literally in Greek means the love of wisdom, right? You all know that. And it developed out of mythic ways of knowing in ancient Greece, and it's a systematic, rational, comprehensive way of knowing the world. Those of you who have read some of Plato's dialogues, like the Euthyphro or perhaps the Republic, know that Socrates keeps asking questions like, what is piety? What is justice? What is beauty? And people he asks that question to different people, and people offer various responses, which Socrates then shows leads to a contradiction, leads to absurdity. These what is questions, if we could talk about them in general, what is questions that Socrates asks are asking about the essence of something, that which all instances of piety or justice or beauty have in common. According to Socrates, it is this essential character that allows us to recognize these instances as particular cases of justice or beauty. When we're able to give a consistent account, what we might call a definition, of the thing in question, then for Socrates and Plato, we really know what that thing is, okay? This concern for what underlies the particular instances that we experience in our everyday lives, what they all have in common, which allows us to say that we know them, was in ancient Greece understood as the search for being, that which underlies the being of beings. We experience all these different phenomena, these different beings, but what underlies all of that phenomenal experience? Okay. And these earlier philosophers in ancient Greece gave various answers to what the being of beings is. For Thales, kind of generally regarded as the first Greek philosopher, it was water. What underlay everything that we experienced was water. I don't know quite what to make of that. Pythagoras said it was number. That kind of makes more sense to us, right, today, you know? Democritus said it was atoms. Plato says it was ideas that are the really real, okay? Aristotle said it's something like actuality or formed matter. This quest for understanding the underlying nature of the world continues today, you know, and we see it in theoretical physics and theology, and of course in philosophy. So let's go back to the question, what is philosophy? Philosophy is a way, you might think of it as a path of knowing that is characterized by both an understanding of reason, okay, what we can know rationally, and I think by a particular emotion that accompanies philosophy at its best. Okay, Reason for the Greeks, the Greek term for it in classical Greek is logos, right? And that's the source of all the ologies you run across, psychology, zoology, psychology, so on and so forth. But originally it meant something like a speaking that is a gathering together into one, okay? It's a comprehensive gathering or understanding of the world, a gathering that makes sense of the world as a whole, okay? At one point in the metaphysics, and we'll be getting to Aristotle here, but at one point in the metaphysics, Aristotle says the mind is somehow all things. Sometimes that's translated as the soul is somehow all things. But what he means is that which animates us or makes us alive as human beings, the mind or the soul, is our ability to reason, our ability to gather the world in a comprehensive way. Humans are open to and able to understand the world as a whole, and that's something really astonishing, you know? Contrast this with the way animals know the world. Let's take the case of, say, a pika. If you're familiar with pikas, they're a rabbit that lives at very high elevations. They're kind of terminally cute. They're about that big. They whistle. They live in talus slopes at very high elevations, right here in Montana. And let's see how would a pika understand global warming, right? It understands global warming as, it perceives it clearly. It makes it uncomfortable. It makes it, because pikas don't hibernate. They have very high body temperatures, so they need to keep their body temperatures as low as possible. So they with global warming, they either have to move up the mountain to get to a cooler spot, or they die, right? So pikas, like other animals, occupy a niche, is what we say in ecology, right? They occupy a niche, whereas the human understanding of climate change, I mean, we could go on and on and on, right? I could give you all kinds of reasons and causes, what the significance of it is. I could talk about, current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are 404 parts per million. We could go on and on all night long. We have kind of a comprehensive way of understanding climate change that really, despite the wonderful experience of a pika, is unavailable to an animal, okay? So reason, at least one understanding it, is fundamentally about our ability to understand and give a comprehensive, consistent account of the world that makes sense of our experience. That's why general education requirements are so important. Also, as I said, philosophy is characterized by a certain emotion, and I think this is true of all ways of knowing. Whether we are carefully objective scientists conducting experiments or trying to understand myths, such as the Bacchae, or engaging in philosophical reflection on the nature of justice, we bring to the activity a certain mood or an emotion. Even the detached observational state of the scientist is a certain kind of emotion. Emotion is what makes us care about what we're experiencing and doing. It gives depth to our experience at this particular time and place. It is why we care about what we experience. Okay. Plato, near the dawn of Western philosophy, said, quote, "For this is especially the emotion of a philosopher, to be astonished. There is no other beginning of philosophy other than this." Aristotle, a generation later, says something similar. He says, quote, "For it is owing to wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize." So what's wonder? You gotta kind of ask that question. Well, what do we mean by wonder? Wonder is not the same as curiosity. Curiosity can be satisfied by understanding the reasons and causes, right? But wonder is, in a certain sense, I would say, incorrigible. It can't be corrected, okay? You can give all the reasons and causes about what you're wondering about, and you still might wonder at what you see, okay? And I think wonder is still what underlies philosophy, at least at its best. In the experience of wonder, we're kind of decentered. Think about the voice from the whirlwind in the book of Job that I think we all read. Okay, Job is decentered he's awestruck by the speaking of creation, right? He's totally taken out of himself, and he just wonders that it is as it is and not otherwise. And I think that's the feeling of philosophy at its best. So philosophy as a way or a path of knowing originates in wonder and continues to be inspired by wonder. Philosophy responds to this experience of wonder by trying to give a rational account that gathers in a comprehensive way the world as a whole. But what is most exciting and challenging and difficult about philosophy as a way of knowing is that it brings into question our everyday understanding of the world, I think. The dominant paradigm, okay? The paradigm that the things we always and already know. the things that we know that count as important or unimportant, what is real and what not real, what we think we know, what we don't think we know. It brings all of this into question, philosophy at its best. It can open us to a radically different way of understanding or knowing the world that most everyone accepts without question. Okay, you have all been reading The Allegory of the Cave, right? Our everyday world that we think of as reality is imaged in the allegory of the cave, where we mistake the shadows of artifacts for what is real. For Plato, the way of knowing that is philosophy is to be turned around, reoriented, and to come outside the cave and see the world for what it actually is. Philosophy as a way of knowing can reawaken us in wonder to a new comprehensive way of understanding the world in this time of global environmental crises, with a radically destabilized climate and a sixth great extinction underway. Nothing could be more important than understanding the paradigm that got us to where we are, and to begin to envision a radically new, different understanding of ourselves, our relationship to the world, and the possibility of a new future. That, I think, is like one of the great contemporary tasks of philosophy.
Thank you, Pat. Our next speaker is Professor Sue Bradford on science.
All right, well, science. What is science? I'm blinded by science. It involves research, experimentation. We may be living a great experiment. You know a lot about science. Science sometimes is upheld as a great strength of the modern world, certainly, even to mythic proportions, and most of you have a fair bit of exposure to that. So I'm going to try to put it in a larger context here, and talk a little about the history and the principles of science and how it compares and contrasts to some of what my colleagues here have talked about. One of the things our myth of science sometimes tells us is that science is just something modern people do. But as we look into the past, we discover it had relatively humble origins as a branch of philosophy. Science started as a branch of this philosophical tradition that was specifically concerned with the analysis and understanding of the natural world. But it also has deep roots in formal logic. So if we trace our roots back and see where the scientific tradition begins, Aristotle comes into play as one of the very important contributors in the beginning. He was a champion in his day of evidence-based reasoning, following the philosophic tradition, whereas Plato was very concerned with ideas. Aristotle argued against Plato that evidence matters. It's not all about ideas. We have to test our ideas and observe carefully our physical world to understand which ideas are correct and which are mistakes or errors of reason, or will lead us to errors of reason. Aristotle also wrote extensively about logic, and in his Organon, in his books of logic, he spells out a method that begins with observation of the world around us, from which we begin to identify patterns and principles of what's going on around us. So we use inductive reasoning from observation to reach general conclusions. And then we deduce and predict things from that we then test and refine. We come up with a general conclusion after we've looked at a lot of cases. And then, maybe that fits our future experience. Maybe we have to revise it. He didn't get nearly as detailed as our modern accounts of scientific method, but hopefully you recognize there's some basic principles there. And so science is very old. A lot of us don't realize that there was 6 centuries of science in the ancient academies before it was lost to the European culture of the day during the revolutions of the day. And the religious upheaval led to paganism being outlawed during a certain period. And with paganism, the study of these old books and this mysterious science thing was sort of thrown out with the bathwater. But science didn't go away. Science survived in many other universities of the Middle East and North Africa and into Persia for centuries. People continued the scientific tradition. But a lot of you may not know some of the great contributions that were made in those early days. Some names you'll recognize, though, certainly. Ptolemy wrote the Almagest, created the first maps of the world that later inspired the explorers when they were rediscovered. The Ptolemaic system of the motion of heavenly bodies around the earth, a monument to observation and navigators taking meticulous measurements day after month after year to put together a system where you could predict the motion of heavenly bodies. Now later on in our modern sort of superiority, we poo-poo that, oh, they thought things moved around the earth. Well, it just so happens if you're going to launch spaceships from the earth, what's the most relevant perspective? If you're sitting on the earth and you're going to measure stuff going on in the heavens, what's your perspective? It's a natural perspective. I think as we correct our myths, we realize there was a huge amount of work done there that if you look at what it was science, and it was a theory that turned out to not pan out causally, but mathematically they had it correct pretty much, except for anomalies you can only see after 4 centuries or something. So those contributions in ancient Alexandria also brought us Archimedes. Euclid, the great mathematician, illustrates an axiomatic system that continues to be presented in all of our physics books and our science books, where they say the law of this and show a deductive process of arriving at your predictions. That grows out of ancient Alexandrian mathematics. And so giving some recognition of how long this tradition really is, I think, is very important. It's not something that modern people invented. Modern people rediscovered science. And science is multicultural. Many advances were made in fields like optics and medicine, lens building. During those Middle Ages where we weren't aware of science, there were schools in the Middle East and in ancient Persia that were continuing the research. Where was algebra invented? Anybody know? Persia, ancient Persia. Al-Khwarizmi in the 8th century developed the method of algebra, and we call it algebra because the first 2 words of his book that nobody could pronounce were aljabra, and that stuck. Our base 10 system came back from the Middle East and the Hindu world as a new way to do calculations. There were limits to Greek science, to be sure. They didn't have very good math. With the advent of or very good numbers, right? With the advent of a base 10 number system and an algebraic technique, we could do a lot more by the time science came back. It gradually got rediscovered. Those early explorers, as Europe came out of its dark ages, trade routes meant that books and knowledge were available, and things got translated into Latin and read again, and gradually over the centuries, we see some of these very same old texts sparking new ideas that then took it to a whole new level in the modern era. So the history of science is long, and I wanted to get that, and it's multicultural. There's no one group of people that does science. I think it's part of the human experience. So a few years ago, I argued that we should all read Euclid and Galileo to further appreciate the great literature of science as well, and not just see it as something technical that you do in some fields, but really part of how human beings understand their world. So how does it work? The nuts and bolts of science are a little different than storytelling, even though there's clearly great stories in science, and to hear how someone came up with an experiment is a great insight into realizing it's not all technical. There's a lot of creativity goes into having a new thought and thinking outside the box. Probably the essence of science, which grows out of philosophy too, is questioning assumptions, questioning the myths that have been handed down to us, questioning our sense perception. You know, is this hard? Are there gaps in this? Our science tells us there's little holes and this is all in motion, but you know, my senses say otherwise. But asking questions that even things that seem obvious around us, and sort of a radical doubt, but in the high sense of it, a certain intellectual skepticism, a skeptical attitude. And so with a skeptical attitude towards the world around us, science is principally concerned with physical questions for which we can find evidence, things we can observe and measure. And the scientific process outlined by Bacon in 1620 in his New Organon, his answer to Aristotle, is that we need to be more systematic about this. So modern science is much more systematic, and we approach things in this deliberate process of first observing. And observation includes, what can we learn about something? It includes measurement, description, characterizing things as well as possible, and then trying to understand what's going on. We use science to investigate why things happen, what is the cause and effect, what's something made of. So observation is the starting place, and then we use inductive reasoning, which is a combination of analysis and looking for patterns, looking for commonalities across a body of things that are all similar in some way, trying to figure out what is that principle. We're still trying to get that underlying essence by which a thing is a thing. Why do we call it that sometimes? And then once we pin that down, we use induction to form a hypothesis. We form a tentative idea of what we think the essence of what's going on here is. So to answer our question of a cause, like what's the cause of pika extinction? I might know. That's not a good example, probably. Something simple. Why does or how fast does something fall from a height? Does everything fall the same? Does a feather fall differently than a hard body? Well, I can test those things. So I form a hypothesis using my inductive reasoning based on observation, just kind of like Aristotle said, only much more systematically. Today we look at more cases, we make charts and tables, we really look at much more variety of experience as we form these than ancient people had at their fingertips. Once we form a hypothesis, we use deductive reasoning to make predictions and come up with a way to test our hypothesis. So based on what we think is happening, we lay out some logical consequence of our proposed hypothesis, and then we test whether that's what actually happens. So we have to come up with a controlled situation to examine whether what we think is going on is really what's going on. And then we test that and analyze it and apply sort of this dialectic of inductive and deductive reasoning to narrow down the possibilities until we come up with something that we can't refute. We never actually prove a theory right. We come up with hypotheses, and if we can't disprove it, then it's consistent with the facts. So a good theory is consistent with the facts. And we've seen the growth of science as there's one revolution after another. It's because we have more information, better instrumentation, we have more facts, so we come up with better theories. And sometimes we have to switch them out for new ones. So I'm out of time, but in a nutshell, it's a little different than those guys.
Thank you, Sue. I'm going to ask all of you to finish up your question cards, and then with the students at the ends of the aisles, please collect those and bring them down to me, and we'll distribute them and get your questions presented to the panel.
Start.
All right,
So
we're
I'll go
going
ahead
to
and
do
get started here.
questions. We've got a lot to choose from here. I just have to pull them out of the hat. I can't.
There are a lot of really, really good questions here,
There are.
and I'm going to premise, so I'm going to pick one to start with, but I want to premise something, just say a little bit about my background, which is really fun for me here. My college degree is in geology, so I'm trained in the natural sciences. My graduate degrees are in theology and philosophy, so that's where the mythological and the philosophical both have been part of that. So all three of my education has involved all three of these ways of knowing. So let me just, this one here, this question, does a mythological way of knowing have a practical place in today's society with tangible and contemporary effects? It seems like a mythological way of knowing is most useful when examining the past. So let me see if I can address this here. Let me say a couple other things that I didn't really say when I was talking about here, but you know you're in the realm of myth when something seems self-obviously true, okay? So we tell a story and it just, and nobody sort of questions because it seems self-obviously true. So how many believe that freedom is a really important value in a culture and society? Most of us raised in this country would say yes, because we are inculcated. That's a very central value in what it means to be in the United States or American society. And we tell stories that reinforce that whole notion there, so we don't even think to question it there. That's a self-obvious value. So you know you're in the realm of myth when the story seems self-obviously true. For most Americans, for example, it's self-obvious that the Founding Fathers were engaged in a righteous cause of freedom and liberty against an overbearing tyrant. To this day, we see ourselves as standing for freedom and liberty around the world. And we tell sacred stories, what I'm calling myths, that illustrate that. If you want a rude awakening, travel outside the United States sometimes and see how the U.S. is perceived in other places. Some things are very much appreciated, but other places see us, for example, as a global empire that oppresses other people. They have a very different self-understanding, but we tell stories that reinforce our self-identity. So gaining a critical understanding of that can be really important. Not to dismiss it, but to simply understand that every society and culture does this. You'll hear sometimes, for example, there's a lot of debate about American exceptionalism, this assumption that we're an exceptional people. When you make those kind of claims, you're in the realm of myth. That's not something you can scientifically test and hypothesize a scientific way of knowing. That tells you about our sense of self-worth, our identity, our values in there. That's a mythological way of knowing. We can begin to test those things in other ways there, but I would say myth is really important for every culture because it helps you understand self-critically what are the values and what makes that culture a culture. I'll stop for this now, but.
Okay, let's see, what do I have here? The Giants and Mets are tied 0-0 in the bottom of the sixth.
Somebody open up their cell phone, put it away, put it
Okay,
away. All right.
thanks for that information.
This
though.
guy believes the myth that the Giants are the best baseball team in California, but we all know that's a falsehood.
In California, the world.
Heresy.
Okay. All right, well, I guess this one's addressed to both of us here, Dan. Why do you think humans are the only animals who need to interpret the world? What evidence do you have that no animals interpret the world like us? That's directed to you. And then to me, it's, do you think animals cannot reason? It's directed to me. So,
You want me to start?
well, I
Why
can
don't you
go
start?
with the
Yeah.
whether no animals reason. You know, well, of course, it all depends on what you mean by reason. I think there's a continuum of cognitive abilities throughout, all of creation. Certainly the great apes, whales, elephants have extraordinary abilities to deal with their environment. In some ways, we might call it reason. They certainly can figure a lot of things out. And we learn more and more all the time. I just finished reading a great book by Carl Safina called Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel. And it's a systematic examination of how orcas and whales and wolves actually think. And so, in a broad sense, I think if you mean by reason just the ability to cognitively take up with the world and figure things out, I think it's a continuum. It's a gradation between them and us. I mean, obviously, we evolved out of common ancestry with many of the creatures, in particular with the great apes most recently. So I guess, where did I want to go with it? Do you think animals cannot reason? Well, I don't think they can reason in the same way that we can, okay? In the sense of kind of this comprehensive understanding of the world that allows us to figure out the reasons and causes for things, to talk about the significance of things, in some sense through science to control the future, to control outcomes. I don't think there is evidence for any animal having that kind of vast array of that ability to gather that world in that kind of comprehensive way. So that would be my response.
And thank you. That's really helpful for me to add up on mine here. I should nuance what I was saying there. I would say every animal has to in some way interpret its environment in terms of know how to live within that. That's what animals live by interacting with their environment, things like that. The thing that distinguishes humans, I think, is as far as we know, we're the only animal that has the capacity for symbolic knowing. That is, for symbolizing our world in ways that then help us to live within it there. And anthropologists, people who study the human species, say that this capacity seems to have arrived about 50 to 70,000 years ago. They sometimes call it the Great Leap Forward. We see it showing up in really symbolic artwork and cave art and so forth. But at that point, human beings made a move into a different dimension of our ability to interpret our world, not simply by the different natural science stuff, but actually symbolizing it and then creating symbolic understandings of the world that then in turn shape the way we interact with it. And that's where storytelling becomes so important, because we get these symbols of the world, we tell stories that help us make sense of it, and that in turn helps us to shape or to live within that there. So I guess that's more of what I'm meaning there. So I would agree with Pat. We're in a kind of a continuum. We're finding more and more that many different animals have very rich cultures, what we could really probably call cultures there. Wolves, dolphins, so forth. But what we don't have any evidence, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we don't have any evidence that there's a symbolic way of knowing that we can construct a symbolic world and then live within that. That seems to be distinctive to humans. Sue, you want to pick one?
Yeah, I have a number of questions here, and there's a number of people who asked about the relationship between stories and science, and I'd like to address that a little. I think there's powerful links between these things in different ways. I mentioned, we might want to challenge a mythological account and examine the truth of the matter and dig deeper to find factual evidence. That's just one aspect of the relationship. But we tell stories about science in our culture and characterize it in different ways. And given the different crises and issues going on in our world today, some people are very critical of science and see it as a matter of manipulation and something that we do I think of famous stories about scientists. There were some people, we tell stories of vivisection, stories of digging up bodies. Bacon himself was supposedly quoted saying, "We will put nature on the rack," which sounds kind of terrifying in its own, torture chamber way. He happened to be a prosecutor, and people debate whether he ever actually said that. But the story we tell about science and how we understand it, is it just a specialized activity, or is it something that we all do in our own modest ways as well as informal analytical ways? I do see it as a continuous enterprise that's been refined, but like Bacon, he saw it as a generational enterprise where we gradually refine and get closer. And even though one generation might have headed us in a direction of utilizing science for goals like conquest and goals like one culture's superiority over another, we don't have to tell that story as the dominant one anymore. We can adopt a broader framework and recognize that traditional stories that people had all over this world were treasure troves of real knowledge about the environments in which they lived, because they were doing observation. They were keeping track from generation to generation of where their ancestors had gone and what they had learned from them. There's elements of science in all of that. So when we learn about Eastern medicine, which 50 years ago people were like, ooh, that's not science. Now it turns out, as we begin to test many of these principles, we find out they're pretty reliable and they meet our Western standards. They were just never tested that way. But the fact that people have been observing for 50,000 years across different habitats, I think is very significant. So there's a link, because our knowledge begins with the stories from our experience, and then that's what we're analyzing to get at our first principles. If we don't include everybody, we might not be getting the full story. So the more stories, in some sense, the more we can find principles that are really fundamental and central. Have we gone past ancient Greek philosophy? Well, yes, we've refined this a great deal, but I think the core idea, we shouldn't trivialize what those ancient people were doing. In fact, we often do, because we just don't know, and we hear these myths and little fragments, and there's a lot of, they thought the world was flat. Well, in fact, they knew it had a circumference, and they had calculated the distance to the sun, and they were doing some pretty advanced stuff. So we shouldn't trivialize it, but what we're doing is on another level of magnitude, and the apparatus and the organization and having the internet so we can communicate, and it doesn't take a month to send a letter back and forth, and we have the power of computing to run data over thousands of countless examples to make sure our patterns are correct. Someone asked, is there truth in science if we never actually prove something true? Well, the strength of verification. If I can measure something here in Missoula, Montana, and thousands of people around the world are getting the same measurement, I might not be able to say from that fairly that I know this will always be the case everywhere, but it's a pretty good high probability to feel like I think we can say this is the measurement. So there's a consensus to our objectivity. It's not a matter of absolute truth, like Descartes thinks he has a straight channel to absolute knowing. A scientist has to be kind of humble and always open to the possibility that we could be wrong and will be corrected by maybe our own students making a discovery, something we missed. But that's the beauty of it. It's I think, unlimited in its possibility. But with generations and generations under us, we have a pretty good level of certainty if it's not absolute. And maybe that's enough. So I hope that hit a few of your questions.
Good. I'm going to combine a couple of questions, and one of them is directed to me, and one of them is directed to both me and Pat, and so I might use as a segue to Pat's there. But this one here says, how can you be a pastor and remain unbiased when teaching about religions? Which I think is a really interesting question. And then, if philosophy relies on reason and logic, and mythology is based on stories that often are not logically or factually correct, how can they exist together? That's a really good question as well. So let me back up and say a couple of things I didn't have time to do in my 8 minutes or 10 minutes here. I want to talk about the multiple levels the way myth functions. And I think that may help us get into some of this here. I would say there's at least 3 different levels to be thinking about how myth functions. Myth functions within the community for whom those stories are sacred, usually uncritically. So if you operate within a religious tradition and you hear those stories, you accept them uncritically and they shape you as a person in there. Or the same thing within a culture. We tend to absorb those stories uncritically and they shape us who we are, and they function to keep us shaped within that tradition. From outside that community, those very same stories may seem absurd or simply false, without meaning or truth. We don't share the same values, we don't share the same history, and they just sometimes strike us as just bizarre, right? So keep in mind, we hear the Greek myths today, and they just seem strange to us today. Ancient Greeks, they didn't seem strange at all because that's the way the world is. That was simply reality. Everybody knew that Athena operated this way and Dionysus operated this way and Zeus. So these weren't stories, this was reality, this was truth. So if you're inside the community, you accept it as uncritically as truth. If you're outside, it can be seen as strange. And then the third way is the scholarly dimension of how we understand myth, the kind of anthropological insights. We examine them to help us understand other cultures. You can do that without accepting or rejecting them. You're trying to get a deeper understanding of them. The second thing that I think is problematic sometimes is on this side of the Enlightenment, we'll be looking at Descartes and the Enlightenment figures, but on this side of the Enlightenment in the West, we tend to equate truth as only what's literally factual. If it didn't literally factually happen this way, then it's untrue. But there's different understandings of truth here. And let me give you Black Elk Speaks. Some of you are reading Black Elk Speaks. After Black Elk tells the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman, about how the pipe came to them, he has this very interesting line that he says to them. This the elders tell, and whether it happens so or not, I do not know. But if you think about it, you can see that it is true. So why is Black Elk telling us this? He's telling us, I think, that the truth of that story does not lie in whether or not it actually happened that way. It lies, there's a deeper sense of that truth being revealed in that. So let me give you one example. I think, for me, myth is still really important, whether or not I accept the underlying assumptions that happened in here. So if you think of the Genesis stories, those emerged to help us understand how the earth evolved. I still accept the truth of those Genesis stories, but I don't look to them for how the earth evolved. I look to geology for that. Right? Those Genesis stories have a pre-scientific cosmology, a pre-scientific understanding of the world. And so I don't look to a literal reading of Genesis to know how the earth came. I look to the science of geology. Does that mean I don't find anything of value in the Genesis stories? No. I find a lot of what I would call truth in those stories and tell me to understand our place in the world and how we orient ourselves to that here. So I think part of it is understanding what we expect of the stories, science, and philosophy. Same thing. Science informs me all sorts of ways about the world, but it doesn't tell me how I should live. It can inform those discussions, but ethics and religion things are other branches that actually address those questions. So sometimes we answer questions to the wrong discipline, I think, and expect them to answer that. Yeah? I don't know if you want to follow up on this one or pick your own one.
Okay, well, let me take this one here. It says, in the allegory of the cave, people exit, then come back often, according to Plato. What does this say about philosophy? Well, it says philosophy can be difficult, because like I was saying, it undermines, it makes us it brings into question kind of our everyday understanding of the world, what we think we always and already know, and that's a very difficult thing. Think about Job's friends, who are, first they sit with him for a while, and that's the best thing that friends do. But then they start to say, well, Job, you must have done something wrong, right? God is a just God. He keeps careful accounts about what you do and what you don't do. And so clearly, with a just God, you must have in some way gone wrong, and so you should just repent. And and by the end, God, the voice from the whirlwind says, but Job was right and you were wrong. He says that to his friends, and I think that's, and they just again and again refuse. It's almost like they have blinders on. Job kind of accuses his friends of being naive, of not seeing the world as it is. Don't you see that the just person is punished and suffers, and the evil person is rewarded? Just look around you, he says. And so, but that's very unsettling to Job's friends. They just can't let go of kind of their everyday traditional understanding of the nature of God. Okay, and so I think that's what Plato is pointing to in some way here with the allegory of the cave. People don't like to have their everyday understanding of the world, their traditional understanding of the world, brought into question, radically into question, and so many people just refuse to take that seriously. In fact, Plato says, if you go back in there, they might kill you.
It might kill you.
So you better be careful with that. So
I think we might have time for one more question.
one more question. Okay.
Yeah, there's a bunch of these, but there's a nice one here that I noticed. What was the reasoning behind science becoming so segregated from philosophy, at least in the common understanding of so many people today, when they were once so closely connected? And I think the history of science helps us understand that for many centuries, our Western way of thinking evolved under the auspices of Christianity and a Roman Empire that had lost its connection to science. And when it came back in, there became an authoritative distinction between doctrinal knowledge, like the knowledge we get from Scripture and take it as authority, like Dan is saying, you take it as truth within that tradition. The scientific tradition was rediscovered, and it led to more and more questioning of things that had been accepted as authoritative. So the same kind of questioning we see Socrates causing trouble in Athens, these new scientists of the Renaissance are starting to cause other people to be upset by their ideas, and is it challenging authority? And the other thing that happened is when these books were rediscovered, it was during an age where knowledge was often taught in a very doctrinal manner. So if you went to university, you would, read these books and memorize what they said and treat them as authorities in many cases. And the scientific way of thinking had to break away from that scholasticism in order to do an investigative approach. Questioning authority is very central. And because those philosophers from the past had become associated as part of the church doctrine, St. Thomas Aquinas had incorporated Aristotle's ideas into his understanding of God and Scripture. And so a lot of these old authors have been retranslated within the cosmology of the Catholic Church. And so when science broke away, they were breaking away from all of that. And of course, modern science was much more systemic. When Bacon sort of defines his plan for science, he says it's to bring men hope. And he's thinking that, if we bring together these idea people and the ordinary people getting stuff done and tinkers who are figuring stuff out but don't have a theory, if we work together and take a lot of notes, we can actually gradually figure stuff out where we can change the world to make it a better place. Now, there's a risk in that, too, and I think what the larger picture is science can help us become very powerful with respect to the causes of things. But at the end of the day, what to do with that power, what our responsibility is as part of creation or as children of the great family tree of biology of this planet, However we see that, the choices we make about our ethical duties and our responsibilities and our aspirations go beyond mere science, back into the realm of inspirational stories and philosophies and the deeper reasoning that binds us to our planet and to one another. So the kinds of questions each have a place, but they're all very important.